I first had the pleasure of meeting this guy in the world of politics because I was associated with one party and he was actually chosen by the Green Party to represent Pontiac.
And what party were you involved in?
Conservative
Don't be
party.
shy, say it.
Very conservative. The Neanderthals. The flat Earth.
I didn't say that.
And we never had global warming before women got the vote.
Can we erase that?
I'm been associated with the Conservative Party for some time. It goes back to having met a senior civil servant about 35 years ago who was the first intelligent Conservative that I ever met, Robert Bryce, who was the head of this Royal Commission. And he introduced me to, this was the 60s and the 70s. We were all sort of leftists. We were all sort of thinking new guys, new ideas. And he introduced me to, amongst other things, reading The Economist. And from then, I started to read more seriously about conservative economics. And conservatives were, up until that time, and even to today, are very often thought to be sort of Neanderthals, and people don't recognize that there's a serious body of thought that is associated with small c conservative positions. One of the very topical questions these days is the question of climate change. And I have a contrarian opinion to many of the more conventional ideas that are on offer these days. So when I saw a note saying, touching on the question of electrical...
Remind me what it was. What was the note again?
The note was, someone said, apparently there's one charger outside the location we're in, and someone had parked there and was hogging the electrical outlet.
That's right.
And wasn't this awful that and could we move them? And I just wrote a snarky little note saying, I wonder who's paying for the electricity. And that set off and that's how we got started.
Okay.
And Claude, do you remember why you wanted to respond to that?
Oh, because it was Richard. I had a great conversation with Richard in 2019 already on the campaign trail. We met there.
Time flies when you're having fun.
That's exactly. And I remember distinctly him telling me about his views on climate change, because we had discussed that in the Pontiac, filling sandbags.
Oh yeah.
On a table there, I think we were having a sandwich or something, and I just felt, I should just say something. It's kind of a backwards way to say hi, in a way, but also to start a conversation. I felt that there was something to be said, I think, for both points of view. None of them are obvious, and anyway, that's how it started. Yeah.
I don't lay awake nights worrying about taking a strong position one way or the other, but I do feel that as a society we're investing more time and treasure in this issue that may be warranted. Climate change is a problem, but poverty is a problem, housing's a problem, our educational system's a problem, and yet it seems to have dominated, for instance, the last election. And all sorts of people have attached themselves to this idea and want to change society considerably to address what they regard as the issue, the dominant issue of the time. And that's just not where I stand.
I always, as you can tell, Richard's already is given considerable thought to many topics, and he likes controversy a little bit, but you'd also like to express your opinion, and I like that. And I thought that was a great opportunity in Pontiac to talk about it. Would I be right in saying that your idea or your thoughts about climate change have evolved a bit since 2019? I think you were even more dismissive then of the climate change as a scientific fact than you are now. Would that be correct?
Well, I would hope that my views always evolve with new information, but that's a throwaway line. I'm probably even more cranky now because it's so unfashionable.
Yeah.
And you're right, Claude. I do love to argue. Two and two is 5, and I want you to believe it.
That's right.
I don't think the amount of effort that we're investing in this issue is warranted. And as a matter of fact, it's becoming very, very costly.
No, I can see what you're saying. I was going to address a little bit the fact that whenever I go on Facebook, on the internet now, I'll give you an example. There's a possibly war between Ukraine and Russia coming up, and I, as an ex-military, I've done some research on. Research is not the right word. You punch in the name of an aircraft type, and I wanted to read a bit more about it. And right then and there, Facebook starts giving me more of what I've looked at, and it's giving me now reports or even false reports of imminent war, of attacks. It feeds me with what I dared to look at. And I find that there is so much compartmentalization of our thoughts now. A rally like we see right now, and I'm pointing towards Ottawa, a rally of the truck drivers against the vaccine is a good example of people compartmentalized by social media, by their own thoughts, and that's all they read. And they probably, I suspect is the right word, probably fail to listen to outside voices. And there's something for me to gain in this discussion. I want to hear your thoughts. Maybe I'll change my mind. Maybe you'll convince me.
Of course I will.
Possibly. Or maybe by discussing, will I put a seed in your mind, perhaps that if I were to change my mind, I wouldn't say so today. And if you were to change your mind, you probably wouldn't say so. But maybe 5 years from now, you'll think, well, maybe that wasn't such a bad idea or bad thought. We all evolve very slowly in our thinking. And I should mention that I at one point in my life, I did consider myself more a conservative than a progressive. When I worked in Saskatchewan for quite a bit of time in Thunder Bay, I was exposed to more conservative friends and that way of thinking, and that really influences one person's take and what shows you watch on TV and what you listen to and what you read. And I think altogether, though, I'm more of a centrist, not exactly left. I'm not an extremist to the left. I'm more of a centrist altogether. But that's really what interested me to meet you again and discuss this.
Always fun to spar with somebody that you respect, and I certainly respect your views, especially because you're a ex-military officer, and that demands serious respect because you've paid your dues.
Well, thank you.
And I can't help but agree with you that it's odd because Facebook has become the predominant source of information for the younger generation, not necessarily you and I, but the younger generation. And I'm shocked and appalled to find out, I was raised on newspapers. There ain't no newspapers anymore.
True.
I still get a paper copy of the National Post. Maybe you can understand why.
Yeah.
But there's, in Chelsea, which is a upper middle class community, there's only 3 or 4 copies sold every day. So I still rely on books. I still rely on sources of information. I don't have a television, but I am on Facebook as of about 5 years ago. And I didn't realize until recently something you just mentioned. That is, if you type in something, in your case it was probably helicopters, and all of a sudden you found your Facebook feed had all these things on helicopters. I found out this most noticeably when I was interested in buying some shoes, and I typed in shoes, and for the next month I got shoe ads that hell wouldn't have.
And even if you buy shoes, they will still get the ads afterwards. That's the worst part, yeah.
So Facebook's had this focusing of attention and focusing of ideas, and I'm sure it's had a non-salutary effect on the breadth of information that we get.
On the topic of climate warming, because that really is the one that interested me most when you made the comment. That really was my background thought is, like you said, some people are not all that concerned about it. It's one of the many issues that we have to deal with as a society. Healthcare system, the military or national defense, supply side economics, just the delivery of goods, for instance. But in my view, as a society, we are a little bit, and I'm saying this, I'm using the word a little bit, I don't know why, really. We are at the crossroads. We have a number of people in the scientific community who have, for a long time now, been telling us that just the mere consumption of fossil fuels causes gases, greenhouse gases as we call them. They were discovered in 1856, I read. And we know that that's why the Earth is warm, but now because we've contributed enormous amounts over the years, coal at first, oil, gases, and other contributions, we have had a dramatic effect on the temperature of the planet. And again, the scientific community is I think some references talk about 100% agreement amongst scientists, but that's doubtful. There will always be an outlier. So, there is a false equivalence, if you know where you may have 95 scientists that say, yes, this is correct, and 5 that say, no, it's incorrect. But the 5 get so much more media than they really warrant it. You know, the same goes for vaccine deniers. Sure. and so on. So, in my opinion, our society, we have to make a decision, and we will continue to do so as we see now the effects of global warming getting worse and worse.
Okay, well, let's see where we can agree. First of all, the climate is always changing. Mm-hmm. We can agree on that.
Carry on.
Secondly, we're in a warming period in this last 100 years. That appears to be incontrovertible. Perhaps we can agree on that. Where I think there's room for legitimate concern is to attribute the recent apparent climate change to greenhouse gases. Let's sort of wind things back a little bit. 12,000 years ago, when you and I were young, this place in Wakefield had a mile of ice over it. The glaciers just left 12,000 years ago, and we're in an interglacial period. Glaciers have come and gone. I think it's 5 or 6 times over recent history. And so there's no reason to assume that the climate change is directly solely linked to the fact that we have more CO2 in the atmosphere now. It may well be a very strong factor, but it's not. It may not be the absolute correlation that we think. Correlation, causation. I think there's more room for debate about it than many who you would support might adduce. And I certainly agree with you. There are figures like 97% of all climate scientists say A, B, and C, but there are other viewpoints that saying, hey, that's the figure 97%, which is often brought out. What's the derivation of it? And they've gone back and derived it, and it's not statistically sound. But again, reasonable people can differ on why things are changing now. But I'm just not so sure that ascribing all the problems to this one factor and then coming out with changing the economic basis of our society in Canada is going to change anything.
How long have we had this economic basis working as it is right now? Would I be right to say 150 years, 200 years or so?
Let's say the resource economy built Canada. It was the fur trade that started the development.
But greenhouse gases were not a big issue back then.
They weren't a big event then. So let's assume that oil and gas in Canada is less than 100 years old. It's certainly, I think Leduc in Alberta was 1948 or something like that. So we've had extensive mining of petroleum resources only for the last 70 years. But today, it's our largest industry. It's the most important economic indicator. And there are those who I'm afraid would be wildly in favor of your ideas that would like to virtually disembowel that.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, yes, climate has varied quite a bit. There was a time of the dinosaurs, I'm talking 50 million years ago, to 150 million years ago, when the climate was quite a bit different, and then events happened that made the dinosaurs go away. Climate has warmed, has cooled, and you're right to talk about the 4 or 5 glaciations that we've had here in the last 50,000 years, which is quite recent. The question now becomes is, first of all, if you look at the temperature records, and for the purpose of this conversation, I had brought a laptop to show you the graphics, but this is not really the context to show you the graphics. But if you look at the temperature records, which vary, as the years go by, we all are familiar with. We all are. There is a Croat or Serbian scientist, Milankovic, who described the tilt of the Earth that wobbles, and this has a long-term wobbling, causes a wobbling of the temperatures, and that shouldn't be interpreted as a precursor to our global warming now. If you look at the chart of temperatures, there is a sudden and undeniable spike in temperatures well beyond the background variations that we see over the last 10,000 years. If you were to look at the temperatures for the last 10,000 years, and you look at the spike, it would be like going up the wall. And the question that
hockey stick.
The hockey stick. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, is this anthropogenic? In other words, have humans caused it?
Right.
Have other events caused it, contributed to it? Again, the majority of the scientists that participate in the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, agree to say the majority of 95.8%, if we want to count scientists, all agree, yes, that is the reason. There will always be a person that stands up and says, well, I have, a contrarian. Just like in the vaccine world, there was a contrarian, and his name happens to be Dr. Wakefield in England. And he made a statement to the effect,
terrible.
But he's been disbarred. Can we say disbarred for a doctor? He's been thrown out of the doctor.
Unfrocked. Unfrocked. In a different context.
Can we say this on the? So Dr. Wakefield is no longer.
He's been discredited.
Discredited. That's perfect. Yeah. So in that sense, I think that we owe it to ourselves to listen to those scientists. If I were sick today in a hospital and I have 95 doctors looking at me and saying that is the cause, and I just look behind the curtain and there's another one saying the contrary but less invasive solution that's not going to affect my life too much, I would be wrong to say, well, let's listen to him. No. It would have to be, I would have to go with the state of the knowledge at the time.
Well, you've inadvertently fallen into the trap that I set for you.
Okay.
Because this figure of 97% is constantly adduced. Mm-hmm. So the question is, where did that figure come from? And I brought a couple of books along to proselytize for you.
So I can get my computer out?
Bjorn Lomborg is a well-known, I wouldn't say anti-vaxxer, but he's a serious scientist who has been publishing and talking about the climate change controversy for some time. Now, he would be dismissed by a lot of people who you might agree with. Yeah. The other book is a guy called Steve Koonin, who was in Obama. He was Obama's former Undersecretary of State for Science. Both of these people have treated with the questions that we're discussing today, and they've come up with ideas that you might find interesting. And the most obvious one is the one that we started with. 97% of all climate scientists today say A, B, C, and D. The figure's not very solid, but it doesn't matter because that's not going to solve the problems today. I'd like to jump further to say that let me grant that to you that serious effects on our climate today is being caused by greenhouse gases, the burning of petroleum for energy. And let's agree that this is really not a good thing. But will you accept the fact that in Canada, we are the cause of 1.5% of all emissions from. Okay.
I've seen the figure 1.5 to 2%.
Yeah. Okay. So let's assume it's 2%. So if in Canada we adopted policies that did away with all use of fossil fuels, the effect on the world climate would be a rounding error. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be material. So when people say, well, we have to do something in Canada, we have to do away with the oil sands, we have to do away with this, there are costs associated with this. And what brought us together today was one of the matters that climate extremists have decided is that burning. You and I drove here in separate cars today. I assume that you didn't come in an electric car, electric battery-powered car, but there are enormous pressures to change the fuel drives our automotive industry
Emotive energy. Yeah.
to electricity.
Mhm.
And maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not, but it has very, very high costs.
Mhm.
And are those costs justifiable? You know, at a time where you and I have friends who can't get hips replaced in hospitals because there's no staff and there's no doctors and there's no hospital beds, should we be spending money on buying electric cars for my wealthy friends, or should we be building, you know, to govern is to choose? And I would just say that electric cars are one of those solutions for which the problem is not clear.
Yeah, you mentioned that our contribution to the overall solution to the problem being that we only produce 2% of the footprint. Canada shouldn't get involved in this, as it should. Last time we got involved in a international venture of this size was the First, Second World War. And we didn't say, oh, we only represent 2% of the world population. We don't need to go. Although that was said in Quebec, but there's a whole different dynamics of cultural dynamics. Are we from Great Britain, or have we, as France, left us alone? And,
This is a good line for your side.
that's right. Well, it has to be explained. It has to be explained. So, not getting involved because we're small is not the solution. There's something about leadership where you show the way and you try to tell the other people, the big guys, you say, you guys should be doing it also because we're doing it and we're very, very small and it's difficult for us to do it. So that was the first element, and gosh, I wish I could remember what the other point I was going to make. It was such a great point.
Well, just before you remember and make me run out of here in tears, what you're saying is that yes, Canada should take the lead, and Canada should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 75%. To set an example pour les autres, pour encourager les autres.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's extraordinarily arrogant culturally, because what has enabled Canadians and Americans to live at our standard of living has been energy, cheap energy. And China has raised, 600 million people out of poverty, out of desperate starvation and poverty by developing its energy sources, which are largely based on coal. In Africa, there are still, pick a number, 400 million, 600 million people who have no access to electricity. They live in the world that we lived in 150 years ago in Canada. So if you're going to say that we're going to stop all cheap energy, and cheap energy right now is coal, you're condemning billions of people to a life of poverty, which I don't think is supportable, and I'm sure you don't think that's supportable either.
Let me ask you, do we have the choice though? And I'll answer this question as I'm stating it. Just look at Florida in the US. There are policies now that prevent anyone in the state government to consider global warming and sea level rise that ensues in any decision making for any project, such as nuclear power stations, building hospitals. They cannot consider, they cannot, it's against the law to say sea level rise will do such that this area here is unsuitable for the construction of a nuclear power station or maintaining the current nuclear power station. That's a bit like saying we're going to ignore the facts as they are. Sea level rise is one of the consequences of global warming. We estimate that it'll be, gosh, I wish I had the numbers because they were all on my computer, but
Make them up.
I'll make them up. Well, if all of the ice on the Earth were to
Melted
melt,
tomorrow,
that
yeah.
means That means Greenland mainly and Antarctica, because those are ice sitting on rock. Sea level would rise in excess of 60 meters, if not more. I've read much more than that. 60 meters. We're not yet at the point where Greenland and Antarctica are going to melt. But there's a worrying trend when the Arctic, granted the Arctic is floating ice, so it's not going to, mainly, so it's not going to have as much of an impact on sea level rise when the Arctic melts. But when and as it is now, when the ice is melting in the Antarctic and Greenland, there is enough water there to cause havoc. We're talking about large populations having to move, refugees, climate refugees. We're talking about disturbance in the weather systems. Our weather here, whether we like it or not, is partly caused by we've got these vortexes coming from the north. We've got some influence sometimes from the Gulf Stream east of us, but the Gulf Stream takes a lot of the nice weather to Europe, for instance. The warm weather goes up and goes across. All of those, El Nino, all of those systems are going to be affected. They're not going to stay as they are exactly. Crop failures. We will have crop failures if we have less water in the prairies, for instance. Long dry spells. Perhaps even Quebec right now, which is benefiting from an abundance of water and hydroelectricity. How will that be in 100 years from now if we have significant weather changes? Will the water always be there? The consequences will catch up to us whether we address them or not. So I'm putting to you that we don't really have a choice. That is, if we acknowledge the effects of the global warming.
I had the pleasure of meeting Claude in debates and in fora like this, and thought that now here's somebody who's working for the Green Party, which is a labor of love. He's not power crazed, otherwise he wouldn't run for the Green Party. And here's someone who's sincerely interested in something, and he can express his ideas in full sentences. Someone I could respect, and someone who had a military background, which I respect particularly. And that's how we met each other, and we found that we could talk back and forth without with no rancor. I think
we didn't have many fistfights. Maybe one.
No, exactly. Right.
I have the same respect for Richard's opinions. They all are well-founded, challenging, thought-provoking, and that makes for great conversations.
And so when you, Gillian, suggested that would I be prepared to debate somebody, and you mentioned Claude's name, I said, of course, I'd be happy to do so, because it's people like Claude that we need in public life. And I would be the first to encourage his continuation in public life, perhaps in a less contentious form, but I've been lucky in my life to have participated in the electoral process, not with great success, but participated, and I'm continually trying to encourage people to say, get out there, put your ideas on the table, fight for them, because that's what makes us a society where we don't kill each other when we change governments. And that's much to be encouraged.
I should mention that I've dissociated myself somewhat from the Green Party. I endorsed many of the ideas, primarily the environmental stance that they took. But I'm not as far left as they are, so I didn't think that I am the ideal candidate for them. And I think they have a much better candidate now than I was.
I would disagree because I think that you do make an excellent candidate for almost any party. And of course, Claude, I don't agree with everything that Mr. O'Toole or Mr. Scheer or Stephen Harper said, but when you join a party, you have to sort of look over your shoulder and who was it that said, I think it was Wellington that said just before the Battle of Waterloo that he didn't know if his soldiers scared Napoleon, but by God, they scared him. And and very often in electoral politics, you look at your supporters and you look at the opponents. You say, I think some of the opponents are better than my supporters. Back to the topic or the subject. You're to be encouraged to run again.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, and I hope that you will continue your involvement with politics discussions as we're having now. Not only are they interesting for myself as a person, but I hope that other people enjoy hearing what we have to say, and maybe there'll be a follow-on to this.
Good. And in the meantime, I want you to read these books because the next time we meet, there's going to be a test.
Oh, are we allowed to do this?